When basketball first became a professional sport, games would at best only attract the crowd of a few hundred people. Today, basketball has grown to the point where there are over 3.3 billion fans globally. And with this many people watching the sport, it's inevitable that there are going to be some fans that range from being trolls to actually borderline psychotic.
New York Knicks run New York City!
Because you not only have people stalking the most famous women's basketball player in the world, but you also have fans throwing literal toys on the court during professional games. Fans that have no problem streaking across the court, to fans that will riot to the point where the police will actively throw stun grenades at them. Basketball can attract some of the most dedicated, aggressive, and crazy fans in all of sports. However, these kinds of attitudes can understandably make players very uncomfortable or even enraged, to the point where a player could actually try to retaliate. And this was exactly the case in the infamous Malice in the Palace incident, where in an already high-tension game, a fan dumped a beer on Pacers star Ron Artest, which resulted in him rushing the stands and punching a random fan. Situations like these can very much happen if players and fans get into the wrong situations and bad emotions are involved. And these situations aren't restricted to on the court, because fights like these can definitely happen off the court too, which was exactly the case for players of this Chinese pro team when they got into a fight with opposing fans outside of their hotel. On March 16, 2016, the Liaoning Flying Leopards made national news in China, but not for anything that happened on the court. Instead, they became the center of one of the craziest fan-player brawls in league history. Just hours earlier, the Leopards had dropped Game 3 of the CBA Finals to the Sichuan Blue Whales. The series was already very competitive with enormous stakes, as the Blue Whales were looking to win their first ever CBA championship. However, alongside these stakes also came very aggressive fans that were looking for an excuse to stir up trouble. And they found their moment because of a disastrous logistical choice where both teams had been booked into the same hotel. After the game, Blue Whales fans had gathered outside the hotel, hoping to see their team arrive, but when the Leopards team bus pulled in first, tensions immediately flared. According to reports, Sichuan fans began verbally taunting Leopards players as they exited the bus. However, what started as trash talk quickly crossed the line when the insults were allegedly directed at players' family members. This was the breaking point. As emotions boiled over, there was a verbal back and forth, and according to some Leopards players, fans started to attack Leopards players' family members. Because of this, Leopards players stepped in and the scene turned into a full-scale brawl. Players and fans traded punches, people were knocked to the ground, kicks were thrown, and even one Leopards player kicked the fan so forcefully that the player himself lost balance and fell. With little to no security present, the chaos continued far longer than it should have and only came to a complete end once police were finally called to the scene. By the time everything had calmed down, multiple people had been injured, including several Leopards players, with one player reportedly fracturing his hand during the fight. And the fallout didn't stop there, as Game 4 of the finals was postponed, and months later, after a full police investigation, the league suspended and fined multiple players for their roles in the incident. When fans mess with players enough, there definitely can be situations where a player will fight back, especially when a fan gets physical with a player. And that's also what exactly happened in the case of a hooligan when he messed with the wrong EuroLeague player. During a 2015 Euro Cup game between Budućnost and Banvite guard Sammy Mejia stepped to the free throw line, missed, and apparently that was a personal affront to one fan. Because out of nowhere, a hooligan sprinted onto the court and shoved Mejia square in the back. However, unfortunately for him, he had chosen the worst possible person to mess with, and not because Mejia did anything, but because Mejia's teammate EJ Rowland decided to step in and channel his inner Terrence Crawford, punching the hooligan so hard that the fan was sent flying onto the hardwood. In the ensuing chaos, players and staff rushed in. For some reason, a second scuffle broke out, and security and officials had to swarm the court to regain control. In the aftermath, the hooligan was escorted off the court, and Roland was ejected and later fined 30,000 euros, which at the time was around 33,000 USD. And EJ Rowland isn't the only player that will physically deal with a crazy fan, because Charles Barkley has physically battered crazy fans multiple times.
They don't have to respect me, they don't have to like me, but they cannot disrespect me. If a fan walks up to me in my face and says something, he's probably gonna get punched.
Because of his blunt personality, zero filter honesty, and apparent lack of fear, Charles Barkley has always been one of the most popular and controversial figures in basketball. However, this same charisma that made him so popular also attracted a very specific kind of fan that would aggressively confront him. However, these situations would actually end up with the fan being in a worse spot because in some cases, Barkley was just as unhinged or even more unhinged than the fans themselves. One of the most infamous incidents came in October 1997 when Barkley was at a bar in Orlando with a woman when a fan began aggressively heckling both of them. At first, the situation was just verbal, but as things escalated, the fan ended up throwing a glass filled with ice directly at Barkley's group. Because of this, Barkley hit a breaking point and he immediately grabbed the fan and threw him through a plate glass window. And somehow, this wasn't even Barkley's wildest off-court encounter with fans. Earlier in his career, after an away game in Milwaukee, Barkley stopped by a nearby sports bar to unwind. However, he soon found himself being heckled by a group of college students in a parking lot. Barkley later said that he believed the students all looked like weightlifters and he felt they were going to jump him, so Barkley made a decision. According to Barkley, he deliberately stripped completely naked in the parking lot, hoping that the group would think that he was insane and would be scared off. And the plan somehow mostly worked, except for one fan who didn't back down. So Barkley responded to this by punching the fan as hard as he could, breaking the man's nose. Barkley, in the end, was arrested for this incident, but he was released on bail later that same day. And years later, when Barkley was reflecting on these incidents, he said that, quote, "I've been arrested 8 times for punching fans, and 8 times they deserved it." Charles Barkley is a rare case where he might just be as crazy as some of the most unhinged fans. However, there are some fans that even go past this kind of level, like when a crazy 55-year-old fan stalked WNBA superstar Caitlin Clark.
A Texas man admitted to stalking Caitlin Clark. Michael Lewis was sentenced to 2.5 years after pleading guilty to 1 felony count of stalking and 1 misdemeanor count of harassment.
Now, throughout Caitlin Clark's career, she has had her fair share of weird fan interactions.
I like that you're here. I like that you're here.
I do that at my family after every game, so
Okay, well,
pretty
let's
cool.
start doing it to me and we'll get along just fine.
However, none of them come close to when she was actually stalked by a crazy fan. In January 2025, a 55-year-old man from Texas named Michael Lewis was arrested in Indianapolis and charged with felony stalking after sending hundreds of threatening and sexually explicit messages to Clark. According to court documents, Lewis on social media was sending messages to Clark saying things like "been driving around your house 3 times a day" and "I'm getting tickets and I'm sitting behind your bench." And it turned out these weren't just empty words, as investigators were able to trace Lewis's messages to Indianapolis-based IP addresses, including a local hotel and a public library, strongly suggesting he had traveled from his home in Texas with the express intent of stalking Clark. Because of all this, on July 28, 2025, Lewis pleaded guilty to felony stalking and misdemeanor harassment charges. He was sentenced to 2.5 years in prison, forbidden from ever contacting Clark again, and permanently banned from attending any Indiana Fever or Pacers games. Lewis was a bona fide lunatic. However, while in this situation, thankfully, a crazy fan wasn't able to actually harm a player, there was another situation involving a group of fans storming a court where a player was actually harmed.
Kyle Filipowski is being helped off by members of the Duke staff.
Now, in college basketball, court storming isn't inherently a bad thing. Most of the time, it's a spontaneous celebration for things like when an underdog upsets a powerhouse school, which was what happened when Wake Forest upset Duke in 2024. However, this instance of court storming was one that was so bad that it actually sparked a nationwide conversation on whether court storming should exist at all. On February 24, 2024, unranked Wake Forest pulled off a shocking upset over number 8 Duke. For Wake, this wasn't just another win over a ranked opponent, but Wake historically had seen Duke as one of their biggest regional rivals. Because of this, when the final buzzer went off, almost the entire Wake Forest student section flooded the court. But in the middle of the chaos was Duke star big man and NBA prospect Kyle Filipowski. As fans rushed towards center court, Filipowski tried to avoid the crowd, but amid the surge, he was shoved from behind and collided with a fan, resulting in him awkwardly twisting his knee. This caused other Duke players and coaches to rush to his side, help him off the floor, and have heated back and forth with Wake Forest fans on the court. In the aftermath, the incident ignited a nationwide conversation about court storming itself, with Duke's head coach John Shire calling for it to be banned altogether. For Filipowski, the injury did require for his leg to be wrapped, but it wasn't season-ending as a couple of days later, he returned to Duke's starting lineup. And while US college fans can get pretty rowdy, it doesn't compare to the European basketball crowds. Now generally, European basketball crowds are already infamous for being some of the most intense in the world. From flares to chants to non-stop noise, the pressure of some European games is insane. However, even by European standards, the Greek match between Panathinaikos versus Olympiakos is on a completely different level. The rivalry is so heated that it's literally nicknamed the Derby of the Eternal Enemies, and it's not just a nickname because the matchup has decades of political, regional, and social tension baked into it, with Panathinaikos being viewed as a more upper-class establishment-aligned club, while Olympiakos represented more of the working class. Over time, this divide turned games into insane situations where the game felt secondary to the insanity in the stands. Because of this reputation, games between the two orgs regularly required heavy police and security presence. However, even with all this preparation, it wasn't enough for what happened in the 2013 Greek Cup final. Before the game even started, local authorities had already slashed the crowd capacity to just 900 spectators due to security concerns. But despite this, the situation spiraled out of control. Midway through the second quarter, with about 7 minutes remaining, Panathinaikos forward Stefan Lazmi got into a heated altercation with Olympiakos big man Pero Antic. This exchange escalated quickly, ending with Lazmi headbutting Antic, drawing a technical foul and instantly igniting the arena. Olympiakos fans in response to this went crazy and started to throw objects onto the court, with one projectile striking Panathinaikos guard Mike Bramos while he was sitting on the bench. And moments later, fans flooded onto the court. Fans started to fight each other, and riot police tried to get the situation under control, but the situation deteriorated so rapidly that authorities were forced to deploy stun grenades inside the arena to try to calm things down. As the insanity continued on, eventually order was restored, but only after most of the crowd had been evacuated entirely. When play resumed, it was in front of nearly empty stands, and while Panathinaikos went on to win 81-78, the match became more synonymous with the craziness of the crowd more than the final score. For a basketball game to have crazy enough fans that police had to use stun grenades and basically evacuate the entire stadium just so the game could continue is probably the craziest basketball fan experience of all time.
How do I look, yellow man?
You look like you're about to tell your friend not to come to school tomorrow, man.